3,000 versus 30,000. A stone fortress rises from the scorched plains of Rajasthan, its walls trembling under the roar of imperial war drums. Inside Chittorgarh, exhausted Rajput warriors sharpen blades already cracked from earlier fights. Outside, the Sultanate's army stretches to the horizon, elephants, cavalry, siege engines, an empire certain of victory. Yet the gates do not open. Chittorgarh did not rise gently from the land, it challenged it. A colossal stone citadel perched atop a rocky hill, its walls carved by centuries of war, defiance, and memory. For generations, this fortress had been more than a military stronghold. It was the beating heart of Rajput identity, honor etched into stone, resistance forged into bloodlines. By the early medieval era, northern India was changing. The Delhi Sultanate expanded relentlessly, its armies rolling across the plains with discipline, cavalry, and imperial ambition. Kingdom after kingdom bent under its pressure. Tribute was demanded. Allegiance was enforced. Those who refused were erased. Chittorgarh refused. Inside the fort lived the Rajput clan's warrior aristocracies, bound not just by loyalty to a ruler, but by an ancient code where honor outweighed survival. To submit meant cultural death. To fight, even against impossible odds, meant legacy. Scouts arrived breathless with grim news. An army unlike any seen before was approaching tens of thousands strong. Infantry columns stretched across the horizon. War elephants moved like living siege towers. Banners of the Sultanate snapped violently in the desert wind. This was not a raid. This was annihilation by design. Within Chittorgarh's gates, preparations began immediately. Granaries were counted, weapons were distributed. Blacksmiths worked through the night, hammering steel already scarred by previous wars. Women and elders watched in silence as warriors painted clan marks onto shields, fully aware that few would ever remove that armor again. There were no illusions of victory, only choices. Submit and live without honor, or resist and be remembered. Rajput commanders gathered beneath torchlight, their faces lined not with fear, but with resolve hardened by generations of defiance. They knew relief armies would not come. No king would intervene. Chittorgarh stood alone. Outside the walls, the Sultanate forces began encircling the hill, methodical and patient. Siege camps rose like a tightening noose. Drums echoed through the valleys, slow, deliberate, psychological. As the sun set behind the fortress, casting long shadows over its ancient walls, one truth settled heavily over Chittorgarh. This was no longer about territory. It was about whether honor could survive extinction. And as the enemy camps multiplied in the darkness below, the fortress waited silent, defiant, and already preparing for a war it could not win, but would never surrender. The siege did not begin with an attack. It began with waiting. Around Chittorgarh, the Delhi Sultanate's army settled into the land like an occupying shadow. Tents spread across the plains in disciplined rows. Fires burned through the night, encircling the hilltop fortress in a ring of orange light. From the ramparts, Rajput sentries watched silently as the enemy multiplied below. More men, more banners, more certainty. Inside the fort, time became the cruelest weapon. Every morning, commanders walked the walls, counting faces, measuring resolve. Supplies were carefully rationed. Each sack of grain was weighed against the days ahead. Every arrow loosed in practice felt like one less chance at survival. The numbers were merciless. 3,000 defenders, no reinforcements, no retreat. At night, the psychological pressure deepened. The distant beat of war drums echoed through the valleys, not constant, not frantic, but slow and deliberate, a reminder, a warning. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of elephants trumpeting and soldiers shouting in unfamiliar tongues. Even the stone walls seemed to absorb the tension, holding their breath. Among the Rajput warriors, fear was not spoken aloud, but it was felt. Some thought of families inside the fort. Others remembered past battles, fallen brothers, broken shields. Yet alongside the fear grew something harder, colder, acceptance. Across the field, the Sultanate commanders watched with confidence. They understood sieges, hunger, exhaustion, and despair were allies that never failed. Why rush when time itself would crack the enemy's spirit? They believed Chittorgarh would eventually kneel, not because it lacked courage, but because no one could endure this pressure forever. They were wrong about one thing. The waiting did not weaken the defenders. It hardened them. As days passed, something shifted within the fortress. Fear gave way to resolve. Hopelessness transformed into fatalistic clarity. If this was to be the end, then it would be faced on their own terms. And as the siege tightened and silence grew heavier than steel, both sides sensed it. When the first blow finally fell, it would not be met by desperation, but by warriors who had already accepted death. Chittorgarh was not merely defended by men, it was defended by stone shaped by war. The fortress dominated the landscape, its steep ascent turning geography into a weapon. Narrow, winding approaches forced attackers into tight columns. Massive gates stood one behind another, each designed to trap, slow, and bleed any force reckless enough to rush forward. Every wall, every tower, carried the memory of past sieges and lessons learned in blood. Inside, the Rajputs prepared with methodical precision. Weapons were inspected again and again. Sword edges were honed until they whispered through the air. Spears were stacked in disciplined rows. Archers memorized firing lanes from the ramparts, each angle calculated to maximize death before enemies could reach the walls. Horn signals were rehearsed, short blasts for breaches, long calls for regrouping. This was not chaos. It was ritualized defense. Below, the Sultanate army assembled its answer to stone and elevation. Siege engines were dragged forward by teams of men and animals, their wooden frames creaking under tension. Engineers studied the slopes, marking weak points, calculating angles. Towers were prepared, ladders bundled, formations drilled relentlessly. The Delhi commanders trusted in engineering, numbers, and patience tools that had broken fortresses across the subcontinent. Yet cracks formed on both sides, unseen but fatal. Among the besiegers, confidence bordered on complacency. 30,000 against 3,000 felt less like a battle and more like a process. Assumptions replaced caution. Speed replaced respect for the terrain. Inside Chittorgarh, the defenders faced a quieter danger attrition. Every day consumed supplies that could never be replaced. Every arrow, every stone dropped from the walls carried a cost measured not in victory, but in time remaining. As the sun burned overhead and dust drifted endlessly through the air, both armies stood poised, strategies set, mistakes already in motion. The battlefield was ready. The fortress was ready. All that remained was the moment when patience would shatter and planning would give way to chaos. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. The fragile stillness broke at dawn. A thin mist clung to the lower slopes of Chittorgarh as movement rippled through the Sultanate camp. Drums sounded not the slow psychological beat of intimidation, but something sharper, urgent. Siege crews moved with purpose. Ladders were lifted. Towers creaked forward inch by inch. Whatever restraint had existed was gone. Inside the fortress, the change was felt instantly. Messengers ran along the walls. Horns sounded short, clipped warnings. Rajput commanders understood the signal without words. The waiting was over. The enemy had chosen action. One final attempt at negotiation was dismissed without ceremony. There would be no surrender, no exchange of hostages, no mercy earned through submission. The Delhi commanders believed the fortress was ready to crack. They believed pressure had done its work. They misread resolve as exhaustion. Within Chittorgarh, a council gathered beneath flickering torchlight. Faces were calm, almost unnervingly so. The decision placed before them was not how to survive, but how to end. The code they followed allowed no half measures. If the walls were breached, there would be no retreat into captivity. Rituals began quietly. Weapons were blessed. Armor was fastened one last time. Warriors embraced brothers, knowing the words spoken now would echo forever. There was no panic, only a heavy clarity, as if fate itself had finally stepped into the room. Above the gates, banners were raised higher than before, catching the morning wind. It was a signal not of confidence, but of defiance, a message meant for the enemy below. The siege engines lurched forward. Dust rose. The ground trembled. Silence collapsed beneath the thunder of preparation. At that moment, both armies crossed an invisible line. Strategy gave way to inevitability. Whatever happened next would not be undone by courage or numbers. History had been set in motion, and when the first stone struck the walls of Chittorgarh, the battle was no longer about conquest. It was about how legends are born in the instant before destruction. The attack came with thunder. War drums erupted across the plain as siege engines hurled their first stones toward Chittorgarh's ancient walls. The impact echoed like cracking bone, sending clouds of dust and shattered rock into the air. For the first time since the encirclement began, the fortress shook not with fear, but with violence. From the ramparts, Rajput archers answered instantly. Arrows flew in disciplined waves, darkening the sky before plunging into the massed ranks below. Ladders slammed against stone. Shouts rose as attackers struggled upward, shields locked overhead, feet slipping on dust and blood-slicked rock. Every narrow approach became a killing funnel, exactly as the fortress had been designed centuries before. Inside the chaos, the defenders moved with brutal efficiency. Boiling liquids were poured from above. Stones were rolled down steep paths, crushing formations and breaking momentum. Horn calls cut through the noise, directing reinforcements to threatened sections of the wall. For hours, each assault was beaten back with ferocity that stunned the besiegers. Below, the Sultanate commanders watched with tightening expressions. This was not the quick collapse they had expected. Numbers meant little on these slopes. Every advance cost time. Every retreat cost morale. Yet they pressed on, confident that endurance favored them. Ziegler towers crept closer. More ladders were thrown forward. The pressure never eased. As the sun climbed higher, exhaustion began to gnaw at the defenders. Arms grew heavy, throats burned, arrows ran low. Still, the Rajputs held their ground, fighting not for victory but for delay. Every moment bought was a moment stolen from the enemy's certainty. Then came the sound they feared most. A section of wall, weakened by relentless bombardment, cracked. Stone gave way inch by inch, collapsing into rubble. A breach small but undeniable opened beneath the smoke. The horn signals changed tone. The first line had been broken. As enemy formations surged toward the opening and Rajput commanders raced to seal the gap with bodies and steel, one truth became unavoidable. The fortress could still fight, but it could no longer hold forever. And the battle was far from over. The breach changed everything. Smoke clung thickly to the shattered section of wall as Sultanate troops poured toward it in relentless waves. What had been a siege now became a flood. Shields locked together. Commands rang out sharply. The attackers sensed it the moment they had waited for. Chittorgarh was finally breaking. Inside the fortress, there was no confusion. Rajput commanders stood before their men, faces streaked with dust and sweat, eyes clear with understanding. The walls could be patched, the gap could be contested, but the truth could not be escaped. Another breach would come, then another. Survival was no longer possible. So they chose how the end would arrive. The horns sounded long, fierce blasts that echoed through every corridor of the fort. Warriors assembled at the gates, armor gleaming dully beneath layers of grime. Swords were drawn, shields were lifted. This was not defense. This was a final declaration. The gates opened. From within, Chittorgarh erupted a charge born not of hope, but of defiance. Rajput warriors surged downhill into the enemy mass, war cries tearing through the smoke-filled air. For a moment, the Sultanate lines faltered, caught off guard by men who had already accepted death. Steel clashed. Formations buckled. The sheer ferocity of the charge stunned even seasoned commanders. These were not soldiers fighting for reward or conquest. These were men fighting for memory. But numbers are patient. Ranks closed in. Cavalry pressed forward. The weight of 30,000 began to crush the momentum of 3,000. One by one, the Rajput formations were swallowed by the tide. Yet even as they fell, they fought on, buying moments, carving space, forcing the enemy to pay for every step. From the heights of Chittorgarh, smoke rose steadily as the clash below dissolved into chaos. The fortress was lost. The battle was decided. When the final echoes of the charge faded, the field fell into an eerie silence broken only by distant orders and drifting ash. The Delhi Sultanate had won, but as their commanders surveyed the cost, an unsettling realization spread through the ranks. They had taken a fortress, but they had just witnessed the birth of a legend. Chittorgarh stood silent. Smoke drifted lazily from shattered walls and scorched gates, rising into a sky that no longer echoed with war cries or drums. The Delhi Sultanate's banners now flew above the fortress, signaling conquest, but the victory felt strangely hollow. The battlefield below was eerily calm. Commanders moved through the aftermath with measured steps, counting losses, issuing orders, restoring discipline. By every military measure, the campaign had succeeded. A defiant stronghold had fallen. A message had been sent to every remaining kingdom that resistance was futile. Yet among the soldiers, something lingered. Whispers traveled through the ranks of the final charge, of warriors who had rushed forward knowing they would not return, of a defense that refused to collapse even when hope was gone. This was not how defeated enemies were meant to behave. Fear was expected. Submission was expected. This had been something else. Within the ruined halls of Chittorgarh, absence spoke louder than celebration. The fort had been taken, but its spirit seemed to have burned itself into the stone. What remained were empty corridors, broken gates, and a sense that the defenders had chosen how this story would be told. For the Delhi Sultanate, the political impact was immediate. Rivals took notice. Tributary rulers reconsidered defiance. Militarily, the victory strengthened imperial authority across the region, but culturally, the outcome was far more complex. The Rajputs had lost their fortress, but gained something harder to destroy. Songs began to circulate. Oral histories passed from village to village, not tales of defeat, but of resistance, of choosing honor when survival demanded surrender. Chittorgarh fell in stone and flame, but in memory, it rose higher than ever before. And long after the armies moved on and empires shifted, the echoes of that stand continued to haunt those who believed numbers alone could command obedience. History often speaks in the language of conquest. It names victors, draws borders, and measures success in land taken and enemies subdued. By those standards, the Battle of Chittorgarh was decided the moment its gates fell. The Delhi Sultanate marched on, its empire intact, its authority reinforced. Yet history remembers something else. Long after the smoke cleared, the story of Chittorgarh refused to fade. Not because of who won, but because of how resistance was chosen. 3,000 warriors had stood against an army 10 times their size, not expecting rescue, not believing in victory, but refusing erasure. The Rajputs did not survive the siege, but they survived time. Their stand became a measure against which courage was judged. A reminder whispered through generations that power can force obedience, but never belief. That numbers can crush armies, but not conviction. Empires rose after Chittorgarh. Empires fell. Fortresses changed hands. Yet the lesson remained stubbornly intact. When faced with extinction of identity, some cultures choose defiance not as strategy, but as statement. Chittorgarh became that statement. A place where surrender was weighed against memory and found wanting, where defeat was transformed into legend by deliberate choice, where honor outlived stone walls and broken gates. Today, the ruins stand silent under the Rajasthan sky. But silence does not mean forgetting. It means waiting for those willing to listen. Because in the end, battles decide control of land. But stories decide control of history. And the story of Chittorgarh still asks its question, centuries later, what is survival worth if honor does not survive with it?